Hello. I always do have to do a side glance to check it's working on my screen over there. Welcome to my weekly live stream on Twitch for doing some Node-RED development. I'm Nick O'Leary, lead developer on the Node-RED project. Welcome. If this is your first time joining us, do say hi in the chat. Hi, Jim Bob. Good to have you back. If you're watching on YouTube, please do leave a comment and let us know you're watching. This is my weekly hour or so delving into some Node-RED development work, and with sort of attention turning towards the 1.3 release in January, actually starting to get a bit more meaningful in the development work in terms of a bit more meaty stuff to get done. And there's some, having sort of gone through some of the things we have in the plan, there's a couple items that are prerequisites to others, things we need to get done to unlock other bits of work. So this evening, I'm going to spend a bit of time on something we've talked about for quite some time, but now actually starting to put designs on paper and code and in files. Yeah, anyway, actually get some code written, and this is around Node-RED plugins. So what's a plugin? Well, you'll all be familiar. The main way Node-RED gets extended is by creating new nodes. We've got a huge catalog of third-party nodes, and that's great. And on the most part, that's all they do. They contribute new nodes. There's a very small subset of them might contribute some other UI elements, like a custom sidebar or some other customization of the Node-RED editor. But we've never really provided any formal framework for modules to be published that customize Node-RED in some way. So with the runtime hooks stuff we've done in the 1.2 release about being able to add in custom hooks into the message routing. One of the things that never really addressed was, well, what's a good way for someone to create code that takes advantage of those hooks that plug in to the runtime? Now, we could have just stuck with what we've got, which is nodes, that people create custom nodes, and that gets you code in the runtime side, it gets you code in the editor. And for a lot of cases, that's fine. I always think of, for example, the Debug Node as a good example of that. The debug sidebar is not an inherent part of the editor. It's actually a custom component that's added by the Debug Node. If you don't load the Debug Node, you don't get the debug sidebar. And as we look at the roadmap for things like the Flow debugger, for things like possibly flow testing, we'll see, but certainly things like the Node-RED lint tool that our friends at Hitachi are working on. These are things that want to contribute functionality to the editor without providing a node. So doing something that rides on top of the node loading mechanism but doesn't contribute nodes to the palette is a bit of a hack with what you can do today. So with that, we've started a design. And there are other things that plugins might want to do that are slightly different to how nodes work. Made a start on a design. So this is a place I've not been for a while. So in the Node-RED organization, there we have our designs repository. So this is where we try, and don't always succeed, but try to have designs for some of the more major features of Node-RED, particularly features that need some discussion and review before code starts being written. So rather than jumping straight to a pull request that implements something, and we then have to both review the conceptual design as well as individual lines of code, the way we prefer to try and do it is begin with a design. So you can see we've got pull requests for a whole bunch of design things that have been discussed to varying degrees, some more mature than others, some kind of stuck, for want of a better word. And and the one I was going to look at today and actually write some code around is this initial plugin design that I've made a start on. So if I if I pull this one up, just try and make it easier to view. Yeah, so our designs follow a very loose template, but what we're talking about here is, okay, so we want to introduce this idea of a plugin to Node-RED that can be loaded as an npm module. What does that mean? What does that? How does that work? What functionality does that give us? So this design, I mean, it's still a work in progress, and I sometimes, to unblock myself, I start with a list of the questions that I don't know the answers to yet. And in whatever random order, just to get my thoughts down on paper. So when we think about a plugin, nodes, when they get loaded into the editor, call red.nodes.register type. It feels like we would need a similar API for plugins to call. We know there are cases where, for example, the Node-RED lint tool, it wants to have plugins of its own. So the lint tool is this new tool that can examine a flow and make recommendations or flag up stylistic errors. So they're not configuration errors as far as the individual nodes are concerned, but maybe you want to set warnings if you have a function node with more than 100 lines of code in, or I don't know, if you've got lots of change nodes in a row where you could have it all in a single change node, for example. Lots of possible rules. But again, it's going to be extensible. So people might create their own custom rules that apply to themselves, or look at new ways of doing it. So this whole plugin system needs a way so that Node-RED lint gets loaded as a plugin, but then other things can be loaded as a plugin that contribute to Node-RED lint. So that's a consideration. Loading additional resources. So at the moment it is a bit of a pain if a node wants to serve up extra content to the editor. I always think of Ben's geofence node, which was a really, really early node, contrib node, and it loads up the leaflet.js mapping libraries. And it uses a tried and tested pattern where the node registers some custom HTTP admin routes to serve up that content, and it gets dynamically loaded by the node's own code. It's work. It works, but it's fairly manual to do all that. So I've sort of longed for a way for a node or a thing you're loading up to say, to be able to point at a directory and say, this is the content I need to load into the editor. So please expose this content for me on a well-defined path, for example. How much we do that in first version plugins, I don't know, but it's still something to consider. Nodes have to have both a runtime and an editor component. So they've got to have a JavaScript file and they've got to have an HTML file. But plugins aren't necessarily the same. So if it's functionality that is, if it's a plugin to enhance the editor in some way and it only does stuff in the editor, there's little value in it providing a JavaScript file for the runtime side. So a possible different loading model for that. an open question. Should it be possible to dynamically add and remove plugins like you can nodes? So you could use the palette manager to add plugins. Now, on the face of it, it feels like, well, why not? However, some possible concerns around if you have plugins that really do customize the Node-RED editor experience, because it's a sort of a domain-specific plugin, then do you want a user in a completely unrelated Node-RED instance to be able to just browse the catalog and stumble over it and install it, rather than install it on the command line quite intentionally? Yeah, Nathaniel, I'm sure that's a good idea for a linting rule, finding unconnected link nodes. One things I look forward to with the lint tool is I know the Hitachi guys have come up with a short list of linting rules, sort of built-in linting rules, but the focus has been more on the tool itself. I really look forward to what other rules the community come up with that are useful. And again, we then look at what gets built in, what gets third-party plugin, but we'll worry about that in the future. So for plugins, starting to look at some of these questions. If you've ever written nodes, let me just pull up a nodes HTML file. And make it bigger so you can read it. Then they have a JavaScript section in it where they call this red.nodes.registerType, registered with a type name, and then what we call its definition. It's this big object that provides a bunch of standard options about the node and that the editor needs. So the proposal is that plugins would be no different, except they would be different. same idea, but different approach. So they register themselves on this new red.plugins API. They have an identifier. So a difference between nodes and plugins is obviously you're registering a type of node that gets added to the palette, and then the user can create many instances. This is different. This is a plugin is registering itself, and it's a singleton. There's just an instance of the plugin running in the editor. So yeah, it gets registered with an identifier. It might have a type property, and that's an optional field. But the concept here is, for example, going back to the linting tool, that let's say, for example, nrlint, which is what the project's called, registers itself as nrlint, then maybe other things could register themselves of type nrlint plugin or nrlint rule, some well-defined type. And that then becomes interesting because then the nrlint plugin can listen for other plugins getting registered, and if something of nrlint rule gets registered, then nrlint knows it's for him and can do something with it. So you can start building things that have their own plugins. And in fact, a really interesting concept came up on a call with someone looking at data science and Node-RED earlier today, was, and I hadn't put any thought into this since the call like a couple of hours ago, was what if the debug sidebar or debug had defined a type of plugin where people could create custom message handlers for debug. See, this is the first time I'm saying it out loud, so bear with me. For example, someone could create a table viewer for debug so that when you're viewing a property that looks like a table of data, it actually displays it as a table rather than the collapsible form it is now. If someone passes an image buffer, display the image in the debug sidebar. Now, those are possibly interesting features for us to build in debug out the box. But what if there was a more of a MIME type like plugin system? So if people had custom data types that they were dealing with a lot, they could create a custom viewer for it for the debug side. Anyway, I digress. But yeah, so when they register, they would have an onAdd and onRemove. So these are the functions that the editor will call when the plugin's being loaded and when it's being removed. Although I still have this doubt in my mind about dynamically removing plugins. There's some UI challenges on that front. But so the idea is, yeah, the code would, that's what the code would call, and it would register itself. And that would, and then all of the sort of custom work for that plugin would be in the onAdd function. Yeah, so that's the basic idea. In terms of how plugins get packaged, so again, if you've created Node-RED nodes, you will already be familiar with the fact that a node's package.json file, let's just find a random example, has this Node-RED section, and in that Node-RED section has nodes, which is an object listing off all the different node files in this module. So the suggestion here is, so I've bounced around this a few times. We could just use exactly the same. So it's nodes, points at a JavaScript file that gets loaded in. It just doesn't happen to register any node types, but it will still get loaded up into the editor. And because it's arbitrary JavaScript code in the editor, it just happens to call this new red.plugins register rather than a nodes.register type. And that would all work. But there's part of me that feels like it's actually going to be worth, I think, and this is kind of why this is still kicking around, still trying to think it all through, being able to differentiate plugins and nodes in the package.json does have some benefits. So one advantage would be if someone innocently installed a Node-RED plugin into an older version of Node-RED, that older version of Node-RED will just ignore it. It doesn't care about a property called plugins. It just won't touch it. So there'd be no harm in someone installing that in an older version of Node-RED, because they're not going to accidentally try loading code that's calling APIs that don't exist in that older version of Node-RED. I mean, it's a bit of an edge case, but it's a benefit. One which I think is probably more compelling is when the editor loads up the nodes, if we've differentiated what's a plugin and what's a node on the runtime side, when it's loaded them up, the editor could load all the plugins first and then load the nodes. Because, and this sort of goes back to the idea that nodes can come and go, plugins are going to be there to add new functionality into the editor, and it's conceivable there might be plugins that people have that they need to be loaded as early as possible in the life cycle of the editor before the palette's been loaded, because maybe they want to do some work with the nodes as they're being loaded into the palette. I don't know what that would be, but it kind of feels like it would be cleaner to load all the plugins first and then the palette, rather than a muddle of the both. But that does then drive, the purpose of doing this design is you sort of make that sort of statement, and then you move on to the next idea, which is, okay, in order to do that, what do we need? Well, to do that, we would then need a new admin API on the HTTP admin side of the house for the editor to load the plugins. Now, in the current admin API, we've got the /nodes API, lets you enable, disable, install, remove, list, a whole bunch of stuff. the install and remove will stay where it is on /nodes for now. But yeah, we'll add a /plugins endpoint that you can get all the content. And we'll see what of the other admin endpoints do we need. And again, it might be V1 is we don't support dynamically loading plugins. So in fact, all the editor needs to do is load that initial list when you open the editor. We'll see. Other APIs in the editor. So the register one I've talked about, and then we'll need APIs to get a plugin by its ID and to get all plugins by a given type. So that goes to this idea of a plugin having a subclass of plugin that it cares about. So when it loads, it can go and find out all the other ones that are loaded of that type. And I think I say else in here, when a plugin registers itself, so the editor's got quite a nice event system going on whenever stuff happens in the editor. So an event will fire off whenever a plugin's added. So a plugin could listen for other plugins being added and then check to see if it's one it cares about. Carrying on, I mean, a lot of this is focused on the editor side. There's more design work to be done on the runtime side, but a lot of the pressing requirements for it are in the editor. So that's just where the design is leading. When we think about what are the sorts of things plugins might want to do, often it's going to be around adding custom UI elements. For example, adding a custom sidebar, and we already have that. It's pretty well established. It just needs documenting. Adding custom menu items. So we already have the red dot menu API, but it's not nice to use, frankly. It's not very flexible. I don't know. I don't have a good instinct for what a better API will be, but it kind of feels like something to look at. Custom library types. So we did do some design work on customizing the library, although we never quite delivered in the 1.0 release. So being able to plug in other library sources in your import and export menu. Well, this plugin mechanism would be the way of delivering. So, for example, you have your local file system library, the default library. There's an idea of being able to add a second add other local file system libraries. Maybe you've got a network share that you want to save your library to, so you want your personal library on your local device, but you want a network share that is a library shared with co-workers. Would be one scenario. Maybe you want to use WebDAV or Git or some other transport for accessing a library. Well, all that library functionality could be implemented in a plugin. So we wouldn't have to hard code all of this into the core of Node-RED. You could add these other library types through plugins. And there are just other bits of the UI. We want to go through and just think about where are the places in the UI that users might want to add custom widgets. The Workspace Footer, this bar along the bottom, which currently just has these navigation controls. We haven't really talked about, but in a recent release, or maybe 1.0, this footer is actually a standard component with an API, and things can add widgets either to the left-hand side or the right-hand side, and they will just get sort of stacked along this bottom row. So, for example, if you've got projects enabled, it's on my long to-do list to have. We've got the commit history where it can show you the push and pull. This push and pull to local branches, or show the number of unstaged changes, that type of stuff. Want to have a little status icon down in this footer so you can see that stuff. Align and distribute buttons, maybe view tools. View tools is something else. Whether they go in the footer, I don't know, but yeah. Anyway, the point being, it's another API that we finally need to get around to formalizing. And then this design note talks a bit around NRLint as an illustration of what else could go on. The design note doesn't talk much about the runtime side, other than the fact there needs to be an admin API. But Nathaniel, you asked about the storage API merging the plugin concept. Yeah, that's I haven't gone there yet in my head, but I think it'll be interesting. Context storage plugins, context storage, runtime storage, anything where we already support you plugging in custom code. Yeah, we would look at a way of how those would integrate. Those, and this is where it gets quite interesting. What I talked about, allowing the user to dynamically install and remove, is if some core runtime functionality is being provided by plugins, like your storage mechanism, well, you really don't want the user just clicking uninstall in the editor to remove your storage layer and destroy things. That would be bad. So I think it's a really interesting concept. What can we do to what's the right level of customization to go on? But it does then feed in, because if we piggyback on the nodes system we have, well, the editor then needs to distinguish between a node, a module that's been loaded that can be removed and a module that's been loaded that can't be removed. What if a module provides both nodes and plugins? Can the user disable some of it but not all of it? I think we may, again, at least initially, there may be just some rough edge cases that frankly we don't handle as well as maybe we could, or the user experience is a bit more involved. Whether it's optional per plugin would be interesting. I think at this point there's sort of a lot of high-level speculation about what the plugins would be and what makes sense. Like with the Node-RED lint, well, the lint rules, those feel okay to be able to dynamically add and remove, because you try out a rule, you decide you don't want it, so you remove it. Removing the whole lint tool itself, that's going to be less invasive. But there could be things like the flow testing framework. I mentioned flow testing. I suspect the flow testing framework will need a deeper level of integration in the editor than makes sense to do it in a plugin. That said, it'd be really cool and validation of the plugin system if we were able to keep all of the testing concept in as a plugin. And I say that because part of the flow testing design says that for every single node, there's going to be a new tab in its edit dialog where you set up rules for test cases on each node. And at the moment, the panes in this dialog are hard-coded in the editor. So that would drive a new API needed in the editor to allow a plugin to add a custom edit pane, and just think all through what does that mean in terms of the loading node JSON, exporting node JSON, because now there will be properties defined by a plugin that have to be exported and imported with every node. It gets quite involved, but this is goodness. We're not here to do the easy work. We're here to do the hard work to make it easy for users to do the right thing. So, but the key to all this is one step at a time. And right now, the step I've just started out with this morning is thinking about, okay, how can we actually load up plugins. So what I've got in my source tree. I keep losing my OBS window, so I keep losing what you're seeing. There we go. So I don't think I can zoom the sidebar, can I? No. So what I've got is a test plugin, which is a package.json, absolute minimum viable, with a plugin section, and test points to test.js. Test.js is just absolute bare bones, same as a Node module. It exports a function and it will get passed in when it gets loaded, a reference to the runtime. And in the HTML, at the moment, it's just some JavaScript that will console log and at some point call red.plugins.register whatever. But I've not implemented that part yet. This is just enough so that we can see in the console log, is this content being loaded into the runtime? Is it being loaded into the editor? And so far, no, it's not. So it's not because we've got all of our code. This is why I'm trying to remember where I got to. I need to turn on my mini map again, which eats up a bit of the side of the screen, but it helps me find where I've been changing stuff. So I'm back in the registry, which is the component of Node-RED that deals with discovering and loading the nodes off the file system. At the moment, obviously, it is all geared towards loading up nodes. Let me find my way around. Just point to what we've been doing. So the registry model, the code is kind of split over in a couple of different places. I think I touched on this a bit last week with some of the refactoring I was doing and have since done. But we have this file loader.js. So this is responsible for actually loading up the nodes into the registry. But I went with this model of abstracting out where it got nodes from. So we also have a separate local file system layer, which knows about loading nodes from the local file system. The early conception was, the idea conceived here would be, well, maybe you want to load nodes from somewhere else. Maybe it's HTTP you're loading them from. I didn't know how that would work or what that would mean. Maybe you're loading nodes from a database. I don't know. Now, in how long have we been doing Node-RED? 7 years, 8 years, 9 years? I lose count. We've never gone near anything other than local file system for loading nodes. So there's a bit of a separation of concerns that's a little artificial at this point. Hey John, good to see you in the chat. Yeah, storage layers. It will be interesting. See how the plugins work on that. But so for now, I'm going through modifying this code. I'm just trying to find the best way into it, because it's quite, as I say, it jumps around the place and it's a little convoluted what it's doing, and I always trip myself up. When it comes in and it gets asked to load, it goes off to the local file system and just asks the local file system to return the node files. And what get node files does is it scans for the nodes. First it looks to see if the core nodes directory is set, and we set that internally. So that points to where the Node-RED core nodes are, and it goes and loads them. It then does a bunch of work. It looks in the nodes directory, in your user directory, in your .node-red directory, for what we call local node files. So these are ones that aren't packaged as npm modules. These are just JavaScript and HTML files dumped in this location. A bit of a legacy feature, to be honest with you. And likewise, you can point at another directory of those if you really have them. But then it does the far more interesting work, frankly, which is it scans the tree for node modules. So this actually looks for proper npm modules, looking for valid node-read nodes. Let me just go and find it. So it scans, it looks through it all, it does it recursively, and once it's got all of them, I'm just trying to, there's one bit I'm looking for that I do wonder if no, I'm sorry, I distracted myself into something that I thought I needed to go look at, but I'm not going to worry about that this second. So after it's got the module files, it goes and actually then gets the files out of the module and builds up this list of all the modules. And included in that list is this object of the nodes. And you'll see here I've added in plugins, and I've basically been going through, and because the logic is pretty identical at this stage, except we're just looking for things under plugins rather than nodes. So wherever I do some work with the node files, I do the same bit of work with the plugin files. So that loads all that gets a list of all the nodes that we need to load into the runtime. And then, so this is where I'm coming back to a piece of work I was doing about 3 hours ago, and I can't fully remember where I got to. So this is actually good for me, because it's helping me remember where I got to before I got interrupted. So once we've got the list of all the modules we've found, including all their metadata, we then call this function, which actually does the work of loading those modules into the runtime. Now, this is where I trip myself up, because it does a lot of checks and does a lot of things, and I'm trying to spot. Yeah, okay. It does a bunch of work, including, for example, checking if the module specifies a red version, which is how a module can specify a minimum node red version. We check that you're loading this module into a version of node-red the module says it supports. And then, as long as it's not a module we've already seen, as long as it exists, we then, for each module, go and call load node config. So this is where, okay, we've got the location of the file. In fact, yeah, why don't I do a console.log fileinfo.module. I can't remember what all of this is actually. I'm going to do it down here. If I do a console.log at this point of module name file and go and pull up node-red, it crashes. Unexpected token async. Ooh, what have I done? Is that because I've... Yeah. Okay. That's because that's where I was 3 hours ago when I was interrupted. I started adding a function and never gave it a body. Right. So you can now see, hopefully, if I make this wider, you'll go off the edge of the screen, but it won't wrap, which makes it a bit easier to see. This load node config now gets called once for every .js file that we've found. So we know the module it's come from, the node the node set is the internal term for what it is. So that's when you have this sort of structure, it's that the name you put the key and the key value pair in this structure. Yeah, so you can see all the third-party nodes I've got, like Coco SSD. So it's the long list. Now, somewhere in here, we should find we have, I think, although I don't see it. See, I thought we would have our test node loaded at this point. Let me just double check, because I may So John in the chat and I did a workshop last week, and I know I removed a couple of things just to not confuse people on the workshop. No, so you can see in my package.json I've definitely got the test plugin, and it's pointed in to the right place. So I bet if I did change that to be Node-RED nodes, basically we're trying to get to the point where it acknowledges it has something to load from this plugin. In fact, so there you can see there's my loaded the test plugin console.log coming from my test plugin, and here you can see the line where it's acknowledged that it needs to load my test plugin. And if I change this back to plugins and then trigger a restart, you'll notice nowhere here does it say loaded the plugin, and test node doesn't appear. So in stepping through the code to get to this point where it's got the list of things to load, we've already lost. We're already failing. We've already filtered out test plugin because it's not found any nodes. Just now when I changed that to nodes, it did find it and it did get loaded. Now I've changed it to plugins, it's not getting this far. So what I need to do is work our way back to figure out where is our module not being picked up, where is it being filtered out. So if we come back up, this is load. I mean, this is the main entry point to the registry loader, where it gets this list of modules. What I'm going to do is a console.log of modules, and I'm just going to try name, or is it ID? I can't remember. No, modules. No, modules.map is not a function. Okay. Oh, it's an object. Okay. Forgive me. So let's do object. I thought it was an array. It's not. It is an object. So if I do that and scroll up. So here you can see the console.log of the list of modules that the local file system has found is here. And sure enough, there you can see test plugin is listed. So the loader has found it, and it has passed it in the modules object. So we're passing that module object into load module files. And it's somewhere in here that it's breaking down. In fact, yes, I can see where it's breaking down. So this code, as I mentioned earlier, it's checking the version if it needs to check the version. It then checks to see this isn't something we've already loaded. So, it stops us loading something twice if it happens to be on the path twice and we get confused. Although there's code earlier to stop us loading things twice. And here, this is the line where we're tripping up. So it's looking at the nodes property of the module. If I come back in here, go and find the right bit of code. Yeah, so it's this nodes object is what it's iterating over, and it's loading the nodes, which is exactly what it should be doing. Oops, sorry, just didn't mean to jump. And we've added in this new plugins object. So not only do we need to iterate over the nodes, we also need to iterate over the plugins and do pretty much exactly the same logic as we've got here, but instead of configuring nodes, we need to configure plugins. Now, this is actually, yeah, I remember now, this is where I was, and this is why I had a half-written function left behind just now. We need to do exactly the same logic, I think, as we have here on two different properties of the modules. We need to do it on we need to do it for the nodes, and we need to do it for plugins. So the question is, what's the neatest way, short of copy and paste, and copy and paste is not the neatest way, to have basically do exactly the same logic on these two different objects. And the starting point is probably just to pull this stuff out into its own function that we can call, abstract this out to be code that you just run on an object of these file information things, and it does the right stuff. And then we call it twice, once with the object of nodes and once with the object of plugins. So this is where, so load module type files. Naming things is hard. I'm just going to call it things. And at this point, this is just very much, I don't quite know what the right names are for these things. I am literally just pulling out code and then seeing what we make of it. Right now, I'm just trying to make sure I get, oops. Right, let's shrink that down. So we're going to pull this code out here. Put that there so we don't lose it. Okay. But of course, there's going to be lots of variables in here that we're referencing that were available in the other function. So this is where it gets a little more messy. Now, what we're going to do is, how systematic are we going to be about this? I think we need to be pretty systematic. We are going to call this with module with this argument. So load module type files. Where did I have it? Load module type files with that. Okay. And yeah, this isn't going to work at all yet because there's, in fact, let's just make sure this is definitely going to, yeah, this is all going to be blowing up badly at the moment, which is fine. This is all the fun of refactoring. Pull it apart and then put it back together in hopefully a better shape. So things, that's going to be this. So within this function, rather than that reference, we can, oh no, sorry. So you've got to do it right. There, that, and I think there's one more of it down here. I think that is almost it. And then that one as well. So that's good so far, but you can see it. This function does two things. It builds up this array of promises, and it builds up a list of all the nodes it's dealing with, both of which we've lost visibility of. So for now, I'm going to deal with promises because those are easy. So we're going to build up this list of promises, and at the end, we'll return them. So down here where we call it, where we want that list of promises, we can do promises that concatenate whatever is returned by that function. Yeah, makes sense. So that plums promises back, the return promises back. Now the other thing we were doing is building up this list of nodes. What can we do with that? So I think this is where we can. Okay, Nick just needs to go quiet for a moment whilst he contemplates all this nested promises and functions. So here you can see where it does the nodes.push node set. See, this is this nodes array which is down in this other function now that we need to be dealing with. However, we are returning some promises, and that promise, the promise we are returning is sorry, bear with me. I am close to see. I've got some immediately executing functions to sort out some scoping issues. So, God, I don't help myself sometimes. Let's just fix the nesting here. So that's the promises.push nested. We then have this then function, which is that, and it's an immediately executing function because I capture the scope of modular node, because we're in a for loop that by the time this code gets called, we need to have captured the current value of module node on this iteration. So I'm sure there must be neater patterns than this, but this is the code I have. So we're passing to then a function that will call when this promise resolves. And to get that promise, we're immediately running this function, which returns this function. So this is the function getting passed to then. So magically, if I return node set there, then down here, promises is the list of all those promises, and results are the results of those promises, which I do nothing with. Whereas actually, I think we'll find that's probably a bad idea to console.log results. I think that's going to be, let's see. Yeah, okay, screen's full of stuff. Let me results.map. See, what do we get? Okay, so that has actually loaded up. I think that's done the right thing, except it hasn't quite, because it hasn't found all of those. And we've got lots of missing nodes, and nothing's working. Aside from nothing working, I think it's going rather well. Okay, let me just think through what is going wrong. We are loading the configs. We are getting them back. We are load module nodes. That's okay. Is there something in here? Just go quiet. Yes, we haven't got module. Yeah. So yes, so here's a variable that we're trying to use in our new function that is no longer in scope, that I'd missed. So we're going to pass that in as the first argument, the name of the module that we're loading these things from. So down here, we're going to pass in module. Okay. Yeah, some progress, but not much. See, I was kind of hoping this would all just work and we'd be able to move on, but as is ever the case, something about the data we're returning isn't in quite the right shape. Oh, there it is. There it is. So all that mucking around with returning stuff in promises was to save us building up this nodes array here. and that was goodness, except for the fact we were still returning it there. So that's okay. Now, oh man, I don't know if you're following along, but I'm trying to be coherent as I talk. So what we're doing now, as long as we successfully load the node config, we'll return the node set information, which is the information we want later on. But if there's any error loading this module, we silently don't load it because it gets logged by load node config. That's all fine, but we mustn't add the node set to the array, which means the promise is going to resolve null with a null value. So whereas before it would only add it to the array if it was not null, if it was successful, we are now returning an array which will have a mixture of successful and failed results. So what we need to do is filter we want to filter null values. Is that right? This is where I quickly get to that point where my brain's not working. So let's say we have an array containing a mixture of real values and nulls. And if we do a filter value not v, it filters out, yeah. And if I did, you get the nulls. So it is 2, yeah, because I only want non-null values. So that will filter out those. Good. Right, save that. We reload. Get back to the bottom. Oh, and that's running. So that has actually successfully loaded all those nodes, I think. Cool. So that was some refactoring, but you'll note we've still not loaded our custom plugin, our new plugin. So the whole reason for doing this was we were going to do if modules module dot nodes. So only call that if it has any nodes. And now we can call that same function but with the plugins object, and now if we watch, you can see the test plugin has been loaded and you can see it logged there. So we are now successfully so this now lets me have a module that is just a plugin, but it's still going to get loaded in by Node-RED like the nodes do. But there is more work to be done, because at the moment we've just added a new way for package.json to identify nodes, because although we're calling them plugins, we're still doing exactly the same logic to get them loaded into the runtime. And if we come back up to here, to this, where I had to break it apart to try and make sense of all the nested brackets. I might leave it like that, it's a bit more legible. It's this load node config. So this is load node config. So this is the thing that does the actual work to build up the node information. It will load up the locale files, it loads up the HTML, that's the node template. And in fact, yeah, that's all it does at the moment. But it assumes it's loading a node. Now, that's all probably okay. Is this okay? Basically, at this point, I now need to decide, do we keep this code as is? And we just need to add in some extra bit in here to tell it you're loading a node or a plugin, so it can then, for example, check, do equivalent checks. Wherever we do checks against the node registry, we can do a check against this to be written plugin registry. And some of the assumptions it makes about how it loads things. For example, here, it assumes you're pointing at a JavaScript file, and the HTML file will be the JavaScript file .js, .html swapped in for .js. But we have said it would be valid for a plugin to point just at an HTML file, and therefore to be no JS file to load. That's not something that's not something nodes are allowed to do, but plugins are. So we would need some logic to handle that. Things like plugins won't have types. These are the individual node types provided by that file. Help, config. There's just basically a bunch of stuff in here that don't apply to plugins. So the question is, do I create a parallel set of functions to load plugin config, which will look very similar? It's doing a lot of similar work, but just the odd bit here and there will be different. Or do I add a flag to file info to say you're loading a node or a plugin, and then just put a bit of conditional logic depending on what I'm loading, how exactly it handles it? I suspect that's going to be the right way to do it, I think. But it's going to involve basically stepping through all the other things this does, like load node template, for example. So this load node template is the thing that actually loads the HTML file, because we actually parse out the HTML so we can pull out the different language. If you've got help text in multiple languages in there, we can pull them out, so you only serve up to the editor the one you want. We also try and scan it. Do we? Yeah, we scan it expecting to find nodes. So we can build up a list of the types provided by that HTML. Again, that's irrelevant for a plugin. So, yeah, I think there's going to be a degree of... Well, I've basically got to just keep stepping through now and find how does the path diverge between a plugin and a node. So when it comes to, just to try and put some closing remarks and some sort of semblance of what's going on. Sorry, John, I had the chat window covered up, so I've only just seen your comment. The Promise doesn't know about modules. I've lost track of what point you asked that question based on what I was saying. So hopefully I've got past that bit. But yeah, I sort of started this hour talking around the design and the approach we have, that we like to try and get the conceptual design on paper to help set out what we're doing, what the idea is. But often with things like this is, okay, I've sort of defined high level external APIs, that, things that the plugin wants to call, or the admin API that the editor will need to call, or things like that. But that doesn't really get into the internal design of the registry, of how they're loaded. These designs tend to be more focused on the externals, things that will feed into developer documentation that want to use these features. And it often then gets to a point where I find it's just easier to design in the code of, okay, how do we actually get this loaded, and try and integrate it with the existing code. And even though this is code I wrote, it's quite complicated. Whether it's more complicated than it need to be, I don't know. It all made sense at the time. And it's actually a lot cleaner than it was at one point. And I think I always like this idea of, the registry was designed around the only idea we had was loading nodes. So it's been designed with just that job. Now we're loading plugins. So this is a lot of work to try and update the code to handle both nodes and plugins. And rather than just hack it in, and there's a degree at the moment I'm seeing about how can we hack it in, but there's also this question of, well, one of the other features we've got going are subflow modules. So I talked about those a few weeks ago, this idea of being able to load package a subflow as an npm module and get those loaded into the runtime. And as it stands, I've got another example one here, our example subflow. Do I? Oh, I do after a fashion. Even though it's a subflow, it still gets identified as a node. Now, I did spend some time in the design saying, well, actually, should we identify in the package.json that you're going to be loading a subflow and just point straight at the JSON file? And I kind of went off that idea because I didn't fancy... basically, this seemed an easier approach because it meant not having to change any logic in the registry, because this can just be loaded as a regular node, and in that JavaScript file, it just does this absolute boilerplate call to load up the subflow JSON from the file system and call this new API. That all just works. But part of this work around plugins is saying, well, actually, how much work is it to support other types of thing in this package.json? What are the changes needed in the registry? And it may well be actually defining a path that can handle nodes and plugins makes it really trivial. I don't want to be dismissive. Makes it a less complicated task to have subflows as a distinct type rather than overloading the nodes idea. Who knows? And if that makes for a simpler design, then all the better. Again, trying to hide the complexity from the end user. That's the goal, even if it means a bit more work for us writing this code. So this is ongoing. If we can get plugins loaded, if I can get them into the registry as a separate thing to nodes, the next task is then do the admin API that exposes a list of the plugins, and then do the work in the editor to add another phase of loading the editor where it will query the runtime for that list of plugins and get them loaded, and then load the nodes. And once we've got that basic infrastructure in place, got to that point where you can npm install something and it will result in something in that npm module getting loaded into the editor, then we can shift to, right, here are the APIs and here's the registry inside the editor. Here we're doing all the time in the registry in the runtime. The editor has its own registry, except it's a bit easier because it just gets given the stuff to put in the registry. It doesn't have to do all this work to load it. It's coming along nicely. But as I say, I only started cutting code for this earlier today, so there's a fair bit still to do. But as with so many of the features I've been doing recently, it's what this feature unlocks that is, I find, the most exciting. Having a nice plugin system that makes it a cleaner way to write custom code for the editor, for the runtime, And yeah, Nathaniel, John, the storage layer. So users can already publish to npm custom storage modules, context storage, runtime storage, whatever it might be, because it's their settings file that provides the module. As I think of it, I don't know how much value this plugin system would be for storage modules, because it's actually something that has to be statically configured in your settings file. And I don't know what benefit there is at this point to using a plugin mechanism to load that storage module rather than just having a require statement hard-coded in your settings file. Now, a benefit for sure is, and actually, as I think of it, a benefit not to be underestimated is if, okay, slight digression, but I think this is worth a quick. If you look at the storage API, which has not changed barely since the very early days, a storage module has to implement this API. And it was designed quite specifically that the storage should be a closed, a self-contained unit. It has no reason to be able to push up into the runtime. So it gets initialized with a settings object, literally just the configuration from the settings file. And everything else here are calls that the runtime will make of the storage layer. There's no way for the storage layer to be able to push back up because the storage layer doesn't get a handle onto the runtime. This settings object is the only thing it gets given by the runtime, and that is just key value pairs. There's no API. And there is a distributed Node-RED scenario where if someone hits deploy and it deploys, save flows gets called. There is a pattern where maybe you want to notify the storage layer is a place today where you can insert custom code when new flows have been deployed that can then notify other instances that flows have been updated. Trouble is, if you're plugged in entirely at the storage layer, okay, you might be able to tell a neighbor instance because it's custom code and you can talk to your storage neighbors. There's no way for that neighbor to tell the runtime to reload. So you've got to do, the storage layer has to actually go up to the HTTP admin API to trigger the reload. And that there have been a couple other places there's no user awareness on these API. Anyway, I digress. But the point is, possibly if this was loaded as a storage plugin, because plugins get loaded, when they get loaded, they get passed a handle to the runtime. We could actually define a second generation of storage API that gets installed as a plugin, will get initialized by, will get loaded by Node-RED as it starts up. And then in your settings file, you just provide like the string identifier of the storage layer that you want to use or something. I don't know. It's an idea. But it would allow for an API where the storage layer can be initialized with a handle back up into the runtime. And that's something we don't have today. Likewise, the context store, same issue. So this might be a Node-RED version 2 type API, new version of API for Node-RED version 2 in April. But yeah. This is the cool thing with the plugins. Once you start looking, there are lots of places they could get applied. So having a good standard framework for it, I think, will make it much easier. And also having an API for a model for it almost gives permission for people to start creating them to do the interesting tasks, to find the interesting things you can do with Node-RED, extend it in interesting ways. Yeah, so that's plugins. That's what I'm working on. Otherwise, yeah, I don't think a lot else going on. We've not got any plans to do any maintenance releases in the near future. I don't think there's not been any hot issues that warrant us pushing out a new release. Yeah. Otherwise, it's 9:15 for me. It's time for me to go have my cup of tea. So I'm going to say thank you all for joining. If you're watching on YouTube, do let me know what you think. I will say, I meant to say this and I forgot to look it up. I know I've mentioned in the past we want to get our code coverage stats improved. And I've obviously been saying it enough times because Aaron has actually made his first contribution, or in the process of making his first contribution, to add some unit tests to some of the internals of Node-RED, which is awesome. So thank you, Aaron. Hopefully we can get this merged soon. It just a few more tweaks needed, but this is really cool. And if any of you are out there watching and are interested in getting stuck in, do shout on Slack, leave a comment. There's more than enough to be done. If I don't get back to you straight away, just ping me again in a day. And I'm sure we can find something interesting for you to help contribute to the Node-RED project. And with that, I'm going to sign off. So thanks everyone. Have a good week. I will be back next week. I think it's Christmas vacation soon, but I will definitely be here next week. We'll see how things go after that, if I take a week or two off, but let's see. Great. Have a good rest of your day wherever you are in the world. Be safe, stay indoors, wear your masks. Hopefully get vaccinated not this week, but I'm waffling. You know what I mean. Take it easy. I'm off. Good night.